Hi everyone, we're going to go through a few slides that talk about blood and the different types of blood cells. So our objectives for this short chapter are to look at the composition of blood, the blood plasma, which is everything that is the fluid that those cells are floating in, the formed elements, those are the cells, and then the last part, hemostasis, has to do with blood clotting. We'll talk briefly about transfusions and how blood types are matched, and the blood tests and what they test for. So the composition of blood in general is that it's a connective tissue. So we've talked about tissues way back in the first couple chapters. There are living cells, and they're suspended in a non-living matrix. So that matrix, or that fluidy stuff, is called the plasma. Hematocrit is one of the tests that you do for blood, and it is the percentage of red blood cells within the entire whole blood. So if you're in a clinic that takes a lot of blood draws, you'll definitely hear that word thrown around. So blood is slightly basic, and that has to do with the pH scale. So remember, 0 to 14, blood is slightly basic. So it's just over onto the 7+ side. So usually around 7.3 to 7.45, somewhere in there. It is denser than water, and males have generally about a liter more than females, and that's really just due to body mass. Blood has several functions. One of the most important ones is transport. Blood transports oxygen to your tissues, as well as nutrients, other hormones, and it helps get rid of waste. Blood helps to regulate the pH of your entire body. It can restrict its own loss by creating clots, and we'll get to that towards the end of this chapter. And it helps with defense against toxins. So all of those white blood cells that we'll talk about later are going in and attacking all the bad stuff that comes into your body. And the last part is that it helps to stabilize your body temperature. The way it does that is by gathering more of your blood towards your core when you're in a cold area, and that keeps your core warm, and by sending a lot of your blood out to your extremities and in your superficial body when you're hot to get that warmth away from your core. The formed elements are grouped into these categories. We have erythrocytes, leukocytes, and platelets. So let's break those words apart. The last part, the cyte, that means cell, and the first part is telling you the color. So erythro means red, so erythrocyte is a red blood cell. Leuko means white, so leukocyte means white blood cell. There are 5 different types of white blood cells, and we group those into granulocytes and agranulocytes. The granular part just means what the cell looks like under a microscope. So if it looks grainy, then it's called a granulocyte. If it looks like it's more of a solid color and it's not grainy, it's an agranulocyte. Let's look at a picture of these. So all of the little pink dots that you're looking at, those are the red blood cells, and the bigger ones with a darker dye, those are mostly white blood cells, with the exception of these tiny pieces up here. Those are platelets. They're incomplete cells, and they will be very important with the clotting process. So let's go into a little more depth. The erythrocytes, or red blood cells, are biconcave. They look kind of like a donut without a complete hole in the middle. They have no nuclei. They're the only cell in your entire body that does not have a nucleus. And they contain hemoglobin, which is important for transporting that oxygen. So this is kind of what it looks like from the top and side. Erythrocytes, or red blood cells, are produced in the red bone marrow, and the word hematopoiesis just means blood production, and erythropoiesis means red blood cell production. And lastly, that whole process is controlled by hormones. And as I just mentioned, the hemoglobin that is contained in these red blood cells is made up of heme and iron, and that is what's responsible for reaching out, grabbing those oxygen molecules and taking them through your entire blood vessel system, dropping the oxygen off of the tissue and then returning to get more. If you have any disorders of the red blood cells, these are two of the most common. So anemia, there's different types of anemia. That means that you have too few. There's a deficiency of those red blood cells. And polycythemia is an excess, and that means like way too many. Here's one example of anemia, a sickle cell anemia, and it's a hereditary disorder. And you can see how this bottom one, the abnormal, looks like a sickle or a scythe, and that's how it got its name. All right, we have different types of blood, as you probably know. You might know if you're type A or AB. The AB, or O is all dependent on what type of antigen is present. So if you only have antigen A present in your blood, that means you're type A. If you have both, you would be AB. If you have neither, type O. That positive or negative that comes after the letter is dependent on the RH antigen. Some people have it, some people don't, and if you don't, if you are blank blank negative, you cannot accept blood that is anything positive. I'll probably post a video later that explains this a little bit more in depth. But moving on, we have the white blood cells. These are complete cells. That means that they have all the organelles and a nucleus. They are your main defense against a disease, and there's two types. If we blow up what we were looking at earlier, you'll see everything from the neutrophil, the eosinophil, and basophil, the first three, those are your granulocytes, and then the last two, the lymphocyte and monocyte. Granulocytes, the way that I remember which three this is, their first letters spell the word or name, Ben, so B-E-N. Basophils, eosinophils, neutrophils. Each one of these is attracted to a certain type of infection or has a certain job. The neutrophils are the most numerous. They are just your basic, anything's inflamed, they're going to go help out. The eosinophils are very uncommon, and they're only really apparent, or they only show up when you have a parasitic worm inside your body. Basophils release histamine, and if you think of histamine and what that means, maybe you've heard of an antihistamine for allergies. That's what these basophils are for. They come out and they want to be involved whenever there's an allergic reaction. The agranulocytes have T and B lymphocytes. T lymphocytes are specific to viruses and cancers. B lymphocytes are producing antibody cells. Those are a little bit more general than the T cells. And monocytes are really not that useful on their own. They are important because they help to activate the T cells, but they don't really fight anything off just by themselves. Okay, two problems with white blood cells. We have leukopenia. That means that you have too few of the white blood cells. And then a leukemia. That's when a white blood cell hasn't really reached its full maturity yet, and it starts to divide out of control. So you have way too many of this white blood cell that can't really do its job yet, and it just overwhelms your body. All right, the last part of blood is a platelet. It's not a complete cell, but it is very important in this next process called hemostasis. And hemostasis is really just kind of how your blood clots up when you get a hole in the system. So you have three steps: a vascular phase, a platelet phase, and a coagulation phase. Let's look at a picture. This might make it easier. So in the vascular phase, your smooth muscle is going to scrunch up. So it's going to make it tighter so that you're not losing as much blood in that area. The second step is that these platelets, and they're shown in like kind of a little light blue here, they're going to move into that area and create a kind of lining that plugs up the hole. And the last part, the coagulation, this is when the fibrin forms a mesh. So it's almost like the little scar tissue. It's going to create a little barrier so that you no longer lose any blood through that area. And this is just a fun picture. This is what it looks like. This is fibrin clotting up an area of red blood cells. All right, last slide. There's two disorders, or two main disorders I want to touch on. One is thromboembolic disorders. That's when you have clotting where you don't want it. So you may have clotting within your blood vessels that don't really need it. And if you have that thrombus that gets thrown along through your blood vessels and it gets to a really tiny place, it's going to get stuck and it's going to back up the flow of blood. The last one is a bleeding disorder. So this is when you don't have enough clotting. So if you have even the tiniest little cut or the tiniest injury, your body is not able to clot that up. So you just keep bleeding and keep bleeding and keep bleeding. This can be either a deficiency in platelets or the disease called hemophilia. So if you have any questions on blood, let me know. Otherwise, make sure you check out the other videos for this chapter and have a great week.